father warned his family to never trust the woman walking dogs down their street. But one afternoon, his son's laughter near a pond turned into screams, and only she could decide what happened next. The afternoon sun rested gently over the quiet suburban neighborhood, painting the rows of white-trimmed houses in golden light. Lawns were neatly trimmed. Mailboxes stood in straight lines like silent sentinels, and the air carried the hum of cicadas mixed with the faint laughter of children playing somewhere down the street. It was the kind of day that made everything seem predictable, safe, and perfectly ordinary. Down the sidewalk, Naomi moved with a quiet grace, holding several leashes in her hands. Four dogs of varying sizes trotted happily beside her, their paws tapping in rhythm against the warm concrete. She walked them with the confidence of someone who knew their quirks. The terrier that liked to pull far ahead, the lab that slowed every few steps to sniff the grass, the little dachshund who barked at his own shadow. Naomi managed them all with calm patience, her gentle voice steadying their restless energy. There was a certain lightness about her presence, as though she carried the weight of the day differently from everyone else. She wasn't just walking dogs, she was breathing in the fresh air, letting her steps fall in time with the peace of the afternoon. Her eyes softened each time one of the dogs tugged at the leash. Her smile brief, but genuine, when the dachshund stopped barking after she murmured a quiet word from across the street. Richard sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea swaying in his hand. His gaze followed Naomi, lingering on her in a way that was not simple curiosity. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, filled with doubt and a suspicion that seemed to rise unbidden, as if Naomi's very existence in his line of sight demanded scrutiny. "She's walking half the block's dogs these days," he muttered, barely loud enough for his wife to hear. He leaned back in his chair, his voice low but edged with an unshakable distrust. "I don't know why people trust her like that. People like her shouldn't be left responsible for other folks' things." His wife, Caroline, sat beside him, knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a scarf. She lifted her eyes from her work, following his gaze, her brow furrowed, not at Naomi, but at the bitterness dripping from Richard's words. "People like her?" she repeated, her voice cool and careful. Richard shrugged, his shoulders rising in a stiff motion. He didn't meet her eyes. "You know what I mean. I just don't feel right about it. It's risky." Caroline shook her head, her hands pausing. In their steady rhythm, "She's done nothing but good work since she moved here. The Martins rave about her. Even Mrs. Calloway says Naomi's the only one her old retriever listens to. If she were untrustworthy, don't you think we'd have heard something by now?" Richard took a sip of his drink, as though the cold would wash away the discomfort pressing at his chest. He watched Naomi pause at the corner, adjusting one of the leashes with patient care while the dogs wagged their tails. She knelt briefly, to scratch behind the ears of the terrier, her face softening into laughter as it leaned into her touch, but Richard's jaw tightened. His doubt wasn't born from anything Naomi had done. It was stitched into the fabric of his thoughts, subtle, yet unrelenting. He saw her skin first, and everything else came second. And though he would never say it outright, not in the blunt honesty Caroline demanded, his mind clung stubbornly to the prejudice he dressed up as caution. "She just doesn't seem trustworthy," he said finally, almost under his breath. As if saying it quietly might excuse it, Caroline let out a quiet sigh, setting her knitting needles down. Her eyes lingered on Naomi, who was now guiding the dogs across the street. With measured patience, waiting for a car to pass before she moved, Caroline noticed the care, the attentiveness, the calm authority in every gesture. "Sometimes," she said softly, her voice carrying more weight than she intended, "the problem isn't with the person we doubt. It's with the lens we're using to look at them." Richard frowned but didn't reply. He shifted in his seat, his eyes trailing Naomi as she disappeared down the sidewalk, her steps steady, the dogs trotting happily at her side. The sound of their distant paws faded into the ordinary hum of the neighborhood once more. The moment passed, at least on the surface, but beneath the golden calm of that afternoon, tension had quietly settled, unseen and unresolved. For Naomi, it was just another walk. For Richard, it was another reason to cling to an assumption he had never questioned. And yet, life had a way of forcing truths into the open. What Richard could not know not yet was that before the sun set on this quiet neighborhood, his fragile certainty would be shaken, and the very woman he dismissed as untrustworthy would become the one person standing between him and a grief too heavy to bear. The days stretched long in that suburban corner. the summer sun lingering lazily in the sky as if reluctant to leave. The neighborhood's rhythm was steady. Predictable children rode their bicycles in loops on the quiet street. Sprinklers ticked rhythmically across lawns, and the sound of barking dogs carried from yard to yard like an unofficial chorus. Naomi had become a familiar figure within this rhythm. Every afternoon, at nearly the same hour, she appeared at the corner with her little pack of companions, the weary terrier, the lumbering lab, the dachshund with its sharp bark, and occasionally a golden retriever who seemed to adore her more than anyone else. She moved through the sidewalks like someone both present and apart noticed, yet not always welcomed. Richard noticed her most of all. It was not the kind of attention that came with warmth or curiosity. His eyes, sharp and calculating, tracked her every step as though each movement required inspection. Sometimes he would sit on his porch, pretending to scroll through his phone while his gaze followed her. Other times, he would be out with Ethan, his young son, kicking a ball across the lawn or riding a scooter along the pavement. And whenever Naomi's shadow crossed their part of the street, Richard's body seemed to stiffen. "Come on, Ethan," he would say quickly, his hand pressing firmly at the boy's shoulder. He would draw him close to close his grip firm enough to make Ethan glance up in confusion. "Stay by me. Don't go wandering off." At first Ethan obeyed without question, distracted by the ball or the game at hand. But after a while, even the boy began to notice the pattern. His father's warnings always seemed to come at the same time, when Naomi walked by. One afternoon, as Naomi approached with the dogs, Ethan tilted his head and asked, "Why do we have to cross the street?" "Dad, I wanted to keep playing over there." His voice carried the innocent protest of a child who saw no threat, only interruption. Richard cleared his throat, avoiding his son's eyes. "It's just safer. That's all. You never know with strangers." "Strangers?" Ethan asked, his eyes widening with curiosity as he watched Naomi pause at the corner to untangle two leashes. The terrier barked happily and Naomi bent down, her laughter light, warm, genuine. "But she walks dogs. She's not scary." Richard tightened his jaw. He didn't answer. Instead, he ushered Ethan across the street with hurried steps, as though the very presence of Naomi on the same side made the air heavy. Naomi noticed. She noticed the way Richard's eyes hardened whenever they met hers, the way his hand reached for Ethan's arm a little too quickly, the way his body leaned, away as if the space between them carried some unspoken danger. She noticed the deliberate choice he made each time to cross to the other sidewalk, even when it meant interrupting his son's play. But she said nothing. Her silence was not born of fear, but of a kind of quiet dignity that refused to bow to suspicion. She kept her steps measured, her gaze forward, her shoulders squared. The dogs, faithful in their trust, wagged their tails and tugged at the leashes, oblivious to the tension that pulsed faintly in the air. Naomi let their joy steady her, choosing not to confront what she had seen countless times before in countless ways. Inside Richard's mind, the story was different. You can never be too careful, he told himself again and again, as though repetition might turn it into wisdom. The world's not as simple as people like Caroline think. Bad things happen when you let your guard down. You have to be smart. You have to protect your family, especially from strangers, especially her. The words echoed with an authority he trusted more than the evidence before his eyes. Naomi had never given him reason to doubt her. She walked the same streets, greeted neighbors with a soft nod, returned lost mail to the right doorsteps. But Richard's thoughts weren't shaped by what Naomi did. They were shaped by what he had already decided she was, and so, each time Naomi passed, the ritual repeated itself. Richard stiffened. Ethan was pulled closer. The air grew tight with suspicion, invisible yet unmistakable. To the other neighbors, the pattern was subtle. A glance here, a shift there, nothing overt enough to draw attention, but Caroline saw it. She saw the way her husband's body coiled in Naomi's presence, the way he spoke of her when he thought no one else was listening. And each time, her heart grew heavier with the quiet shame of knowing that the man she loved was still chained by something he could not or would not see for what it was. Naomi, for her part, carried on. She greeted Ethan with a smile when their eyes met, even as Richard tugged him closer. She slowed her steps for safety when crossing paths, ensuring her dogs didn't stray into their space, and she swallowed the sting of his mistrust, holding her silence like a shield, not out of submission, but out of wisdom, for she knew, in ways Richard could not yet imagine, that life had its own way of revealing truth. The afternoon shimmered with a heavy warmth, the kind that clung to the skin and slowed time itself. The neighborhood park, a small pocket of green nestled between quiet streets, buzzed with life. Children darted across the playground, their laughter rising above the drone of cicadas. Parents lounged on benches, sipping bottled water, their conversations blending into the lazy hum of summer. Naomi arrived at the park with her familiar company, a bundle of wagging tails and restless paws. The terrier strained against its leash, eager to chase the drifting scent of grilled food from a nearby picnic. The lab ambled happily, tongue lolling in the heat, while the dachshund barked at a passing squirrel. Naomi moved with practiced patience, her hands steady, her voice low and soothing as she guided them onto the shaded path that curved around the pond. The pond glistened beneath the sunlight, its surface dotted with lily pads and ripples from dragonflies skimming close to the water. Families often gathered here in the late afternoons, and today it was no different. Children crouched along the edge to toss breadcrumbs to the ducks, who quacked and flapped lazily in gratitude. Not far away, Richard sat on a park bench, his phone glowing in his hand. Ethan scampered near the water's edge, crouching low to watch a frog leap from the reeds into the pond. Caroline sat beside her husband, her eyes shifting uneasily between her son and the glowing screen. That seemed to swallow Richard whole. "Richard," she said softly, her tone edged with concern. "He's too close to the water. Tell him to step back." Richard barely looked up. His thumb flicked across the screen, scrolling through a stream of headlines and emails. "He's fine," he muttered, his tone distracted. "He knows how to be careful." Caroline's gaze sharpened. Ethan leaned further forward, his sneakers inches from the slick edge. "He's 6, she reminded him, her voice rising slightly. 6-year-olds don't always know how to be careful." But Richard waved her off with a half-hearted grunt, never lifting his eyes from the glowing device. Caroline pressed her lips together, her heart tightening with the unease of a mother whose warning was dismissed. Meanwhile, Naomi walked the curve of the path that hugged the pond, her dogs pulling her gently toward the shaded side where benches offered a brief reprieve from the heat. She noticed Ethan by the water, his little figure crouched dangerously close to the edge. She also noticed Caroline watching him with worry, and Richard with his eyes locked firmly on his phone. Naomi's steps slowed, her instincts pricked, but she said nothing. This was not her place. The stillness broke in an instant. A sharp cry split the air. The sound of splashing water followed, violent and sudden, as Ethan's small frame tipped forward and vanished beneath the surface. The pond, once shimmering and calm, churned with frantic ripples. Caroline leapt to her feet with a scream. "Ethan!" Her voice tore through the air, raw with terror. Richard's head jerked up, his phone tumbling from his hands and clattering to the ground. His eyes widened, horror flooding every line of his face as he saw only bubbles and thrashing water where his son had been. He surged halfway from the bench, then froze. The world seemed to collapse inward. Caroline rushed toward the water, her sandals slipping on the grass. "Richard, do something," she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. But Richard's body betrayed him. His legs felt like stone, his chest constricted, his breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed to move, to dive, to tear through the water for his son, but fear clamped him in place, paralyzing him in the most crucial moment. He could only stare, helpless, his horror mirrored in the widening eyes of other parents, who were beginning to shout. The dogs barked wildly, tugging at their leashes as if sensing the chaos. And then, Naomi moved. Her decision was instinct, faster than thought. She dropped the leashes, her hands unfastening them in one fluid motion. The dogs circled anxiously at the path, barking. But Naomi's body had already hit the ground running. Her sandals slipped off as she sprinted to the pond's edge. Without hesitation, without calculation, she dove headfirst into the murky water. The shock of the cold closed around her, but she fought through it, her eyes open, searching for a heartbeat. There was nothing, just green-tinged darkness and a silence that pressed into her ears. Then she saw him, Ethan, his small body sinking, arms flailing weakly, bubbles escaping from his mouth. Naomi kicked hard, her arms slicing through the water. She reached him just as his movements slowed, her hands grasping his arm, pulling him firmly against her. He was heavier than she expected, the dead weight of panic and waterlogged clothes, but she held him tight, her lungs burning as she fought toward the surface. When her head broke through, she gasped sharply, her grip never loosening on Ethan. He coughed and sputtered, choking on pond water, His little hands clawing desperately at her shirt. Naomi kept her voice steady despite her own trembling. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely, pulling him toward the bank. "You're safe. I've got you." Caroline was already kneeling at the edge, her arms outstretched, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, oh, God, Ethan." Naomi pushed the boy into his mother's arms, helping lift him onto the grass. Ethan coughed, cried, and clung desperately to Caroline, who wrapped herself around him. With sobs of relief, Richard stood only a few feet away, pale and shaking, his hands limp at his sides, his mouth open, but no words came. His body trembled with the shock of watching another do what he had failed to do. The park had fallen into a stunned silence, all eyes fixed on the dripping woman who now pulled herself from the pond, water streaming down her arms, her chest heaving from exertion. Naomi's gaze flicked briefly toward Richard, calm yet unflinching. He could not hold her eyes. For the first time, Richard felt the full weight of his mistrust, not as caution, not as wisdom, but as something hollow, shameful, and small. For a heartbeat, the park seemed suspended in silence, one of those rare, breathless pauses when the world holds still before crashing into motion. Naomi's body sliced through the water, a blur of arms and determination. The pond closed over her head with a muted splash, leaving only ripples and frantic barking in her wake. The leashes lay tangled on the path where she had dropped them. The dogs circling in agitation, they whined and pulled at their collars, their small bodies desperate to follow her, as if they'd understood the danger unfolding in the water. Children stopped mid-play, balls rolling forgotten across the grass. Parents leapt from their benches, hands clamped over their mouths. Caroline knelt at the pond's edge, reaching forward helplessly, tears streaming, her voice breaking in a litany of her son's name. Richard stood frozen, his legs trembling beneath him, his hands twitching uselessly at his sides. His face had drained of color, leaving only the stark imprint of guilt etched into every line. He stared at the water's surface as though his mind could not process what was happening. His son submerged, another leaping in without hesitation. Then, movement. Naomi broke the surface, her arms straining, pulling Ethan with her. The boy coughed violently, choking on water, his cries thin but alive. His small fingers clawed at Naomi's shirt, his eyes wide with panic. Naomi's voice, though breathless, carried a firm steadiness. "Hold on. You're safe. I've got you." Relief crashed through the crowd. Caroline let out a sob so sharp it seemed to split the air. Richard stumbled forward at last, his body jerking into motion, his legs unsteady as though carrying the weight of his failure. He fell to his knees on the grass beside Caroline, reaching out toward his son with shaking hands. Naomi swam the final strokes toward the bank, her chest burning, every muscle taut with effort. Water streamed from her hair and clothes as she pushed Ethan upward, placing him firmly into Caroline's arms. Caroline clutched him against her, rocking back and forth, her sobs muffled against his wet hair. Ethan coughed again, then buried his face into his mother's shoulder, his body trembling. Richard leaned close, his hand hovering, afraid to touch his son as though he had forfeited the right. His lips moved, but no words came, only a rasp of breath that caught in his throat. Naomi pulled herself onto the grass, collapsing onto her knees. She bent forward, catching her breath, water dripping from her arms and pooling around her. The world around her blurred into the background, the shouts of the other parents, the sharp barking of her dogs, the murmurs of onlookers. All she could feel was the weight of adrenaline, the cold pond clinging to her skin, and the faint echo of Ethan's tiny hands gripping hers underwater. The dogs gathered close, circling her in frantic loops. The terrier barked as though demanding answers. The lab whined and pressed his nose to her shoulder. The dachshund pawed at her ankle. Their loyalty was both comic and heartbreaking, a reminder that even in chaos, love clung stubbornly. Naomi reached out weakly, running a hand across the lab's wet nose, whispering reassurance through her ragged breaths. Richard finally broke. He leaned closer to his son, pressing trembling kisses to Ethan's wet hair. Relief coursed through him, but it carried a bitter edge because it was not his arms that had pulled Ethan from the water, not his courage that had steadied the moment. He had frozen, paralyzed by fear, and in that space where his love had faltered, Naomi had acted. He turned his eyes toward her. She sat on the grass, drenched, exhausted, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Her gaze met his briefly calm, steady, unreadable. There was no gloating there, no anger, No smug triumph, only the quiet presence of someone who had done what was right without hesitation. Richard's throat tightened. His words caught behind the wall of shame pressing against his chest. He wanted to thank her, but the words twisted into something else, something heavier, harder to speak. Around them, the park had fallen into a kind of reverent hush. Parents clutched their children closer, their eyes fixed on Naomi. Strangers, who had barely noticed her before, now looked at her with something akin to awe. Even the ducks had gone silent, gliding slowly across the pond as though unwilling to disturb the fragile stillness. Time seemed suspended. Caroline broke the quiet first. She lifted her tear-streaked face toward Naomi, her voice shaking but full of gratitude. "Thank you. You saved him. You saved my baby." Naomi nodded faintly, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks. "He'll be all right," she said softly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her body. She looked down at Ethan, who peeked out from his mother's embrace, his small face pale and tear-streaked, but alive. Naomi's lips curved into the faintest smile. Richard swallowed hard, his chest aching, guilt twisted inside him like a blade. He had doubted her, avoided her, labeled her as someone untrustworthy, yet in the moment of truth, when his son's life hung in balance, it was Naomi, the woman he mistrusted most, who had leapt without hesitation. The weight of it pressed on him with unbearable force. His eyes dropped to the grass, unable to hold her gaze any longer. Relief and shame warred inside him, leaving him trembling. The crowd still stared, as though collectively aware they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just a rescue, but a moment that stripped bare the quiet lies of prejudice. And in the middle of it all, Naomi sat calmly with the dogs circling her soaked clothes clinging to her skin, her dignity unshaken, her courage undeniable. The park had begun to stir again, though the atmosphere remained fragile. Like glass stretched to thin, children whispered in hushed voices, clinging tighter to their parents' hands. A woman on a nearby bench dabbed her eyes with a tissue, and the ducks, sensing the stillness, drifted further into the pond as if retreating from the weight of human emotion. On the grass, Ethan clung to his mother, his sobs softening into hiccups. Caroline rocked him gently, her tears dampening his wet hair as she whispered soothing words that were as much for herself as for him. "You're safe now, sweetheart. You're safe." Naomi sat only a few feet away, her body weary, her clothes dripping into the soil beneath her. Water glistened on her arms and face, tracing down her cheeks like silent trails. Her chest still rose heavily with each breath, but her eyes remained steady, anchored in a calm that seemed unshakable. Richard hovered at the edge of it all, his body trembling as though he no longer knew how to carry his own weight. His son was alive, safe, saved, and yet Richard could not find the joy that should have overtaken him. Relief tangled with shame, choking him until the words clawed their way out of his throat. He crouched down, his knees pressing into the damp grass. His voice broke, raw and thin. "I didn't trust you." The words hung in the air, trembling with the weight of their honesty. They were not just an admission but a confession, one that echoed louder in the silence than he had intended. His eyes, pale with exhaustion and guilt, searched Naomi's face, desperate for something: absolution, forgiveness, or maybe just understanding. Naomi turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. Her eyes carried no anger, no triumph, only the quiet depth of someone who had seen this truth before, countless times, and had long since learned not to be surprised by it. She let his words settle before answering, her voice calm, even gentle, though the power in it was undeniable. "You didn't need to," she said softly, her tone cutting through the air with clarity. "You just needed someone to care." The simplicity of it struck harder than any accusation could have. Richard flinched, as though the words themselves had pierced through the fragile armor of his self-deception. His breath caught, and he lowered his eyes, unable to hold the weight of her gaze any longer. Caroline reached across the small space between them, her hand, trembling but certain, found Naomi's shoulder. Her touch was warm, a silent acknowledgement of the debt no words could repay. Tears streaked down her face as she whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for saving my baby." Naomi inclined her head gently, her lips curving into a small, weary smile. She didn't answer, because there was nothing more to say. Her act had spoken, louder than words ever could. Richard's hands clenched into fists in the grass. His throat burned with the words he couldn't bring himself to speak. He wanted to apologize, to strip the poison of his prejudice bare and leave it behind. But shame locked his tongue, and the weight of his failure pressed him down. rendering him silent. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, the urgency of the moment fading into whispered stories that would ripple across the neighborhood. Before the evening came, parents gathered their children closer, their eyes still darting toward Naomi with a mixture of gratitude and awe. For them, she had become something undeniable, a reminder that courage often wore faces they had overlooked. But Richard remained still, his body folded close to the ground, his mind replaying every choice that had led to this moment. The muttered words on his porch, the deliberate crossings to the other side of the street, the hand that pulled Ethan away whenever Naomi approached. Each memory seared into him now, cruel reminders of how small his judgment had been. And here she sat, soaked to the skin, shivering slightly from the cold pond water, but upright, calm, and unbroken. She had risked everything for his son without hesitation when he himself had been rooted in fear. Her humanity stood in stark, undeniable contrast to the shallow mistrust he had clung to. Caroline pulled Ethan tighter against her chest and glanced toward her husband. Her eyes were sharp, her expression weighted with something he could not meet. She had always disagreed with him, but now the truth was carved plainly between them. His prejudice, laid bare, was no longer a shadow hidden in mutters and excuses. It was a glaring absence of courage. When it had mattered most, Naomi rose slowly to her feet, her movements tired but steady, the dogs pressed close to her legs, their tails wagging anxiously as though eager to remind her she was not alone. She gathered their leashes with practiced hands, her dignity intact despite the water dripping from her clothes. Richard lifted his head just enough to watch her. He wanted to stop her, to say more, to try and bridge the chasm between them. But the words never came. He was left in silence, his shame speaking louder than anything he might have said. As Naomi turned to leave, guiding the dogs gently back toward the path, time seemed to slow once more. Every eye in the park followed her, the image of her strength, imprinted in the golden afternoon light. Richard's gaze lingered until she disappeared beyond the curve of the pond, swallowed by the shade of the trees. His son was safe in his arms, but the truth pressed heavier than ever. The woman he had doubted, avoided, and dismissed had proven more trustworthy than he could ever claim to be. And for the first time, Richard truly saw the cost of the lens he had chosen to look through. The sun had shifted lower in the sky, spilling long golden beams across the park. The afternoon hum returned little by little, children's laughter, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the faint splash of ducks gliding across the pond. Yet, the atmosphere still carried something different, as though the very air remembered what had happened only moments before. Naomi walked slowly along the path, her dogs gathered close to her sides, their leashes tangled briefly, the terrier tugging ahead while the dachshund sniffed stubbornly at the grass. She adjusted them with patient hands, her movements calm, unhurried. Though her body was still heavy with exhaustion, the pond water dripped steadily from her clothes, darkening the gravel beneath her steps, but she didn't falter. Her figure grew smaller with each step, moving further into the fading light. Yet the impression she left behind was far larger than her silhouette. The crowd that had gathered began to scatter, though they did so quietly, casting backward glances at her. They would go home and tell the story of the woman who leapt into the pond, without hesitation, of the boy saved from drowning, of the truth that revealed itself in the span of a single heartbeat. Richard remained where he was on the grass, his son cradled in his arms. Ethan's small body was still trembling, his breath coming in uneven hiccups, but he was alive. Richard held him as though he could anchor him to safety by sheer force of will, his grip tight, almost desperate. He pressed his cheek into Ethan's damp hair, eyes closed, clinging to the fragile miracle he had nearly lost. Caroline sat beside them, one arm wrapped around both father and son. Her eyes followed Naomi's retreating figure with a kind of reverence. Gratitude clung to her expression, but beneath it lay something else, quiet vindication. She had always known Naomi was trustworthy, always sensed the quiet dignity in her. Now it was no longer her conviction alone. It was a truth carved into the memory of the entire park. Richard finally lifted his head. His gaze followed Naomi until she disappeared around the bend, swallowed by the trees. Silence stretched between him and his wife, broken only by the soft hiccups of their child. For Richard, the silence was unbearable. He had no words that could mend the chasm his actions and inactions had revealed. His prejudice, once disguised as caution, now lay in pieces at his feet. He had doubted Naomi, avoided her, pulled his son away from her shadow, and when it mattered most. When Ethan's life was slipping beneath the water, it was Naomi who had shown the courage he lacked. The truth pressed down on him, heavy and merciless. His hands tightened around Ethan's small frame, as though by holding his son, he might somehow atone for failing him, but the weight of his shame lingered, refusing to be softened by the boy's fragile safety. Caroline glanced at him, her eyes steady. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her hand reached to rest gently on his arm, a reminder of presence, of accountability. Richard turned his face away, unable to meet her gaze. In that silence, the narrator's voice might have carried the reflection of the moment. Sometimes, the people we doubt the most are the ones who carry the greatest courage. Trust is not written in skin, but in actions, and kindness, when tested, speaks louder than any prejudice ever could. The lesson lingered, unspoken yet undeniable, echoing in the quiet spaces of Richard's heart. He looked again toward the path where Naomi had vanished. For the first time, he saw her not as an outsider, not as a stranger to be judged, but as a mirror reflecting his own failings. She had been everything he claimed she could not be: steady, brave, trustworthy, and he had been the one paralyzed by fear, shackled not by circumstance, but by his own blindness. Ethan stirred in his arms, his small voice breaking through the silence. "Daddy," he whispered, his words muffled against his father's shirt. "The dog lady saved me." Richard's chest tightened. The innocence of the words, the purity of his son's truth, cut through him with more force than any judgment could. He kissed Ethan's hair, his lips trembling, tears he had held back spilling freely at last. "Yes," he whispered hoarsely, "she did." Caroline closed her eyes, her head leaning briefly against his shoulder. The three of them sat together in the waning light, bound by gratitude, by relief, and by the unshakable truth that the world was not what Richard had always thought it to be. The park continued on, life resuming as though nothing had happened. Yet everything had changed. The ripples from the pond faded into stillness, but the ripples in Richard's heart would not disappear so easily. They would follow him home, haunt his thoughts, shape the way he looked at others from that day forward. And in the fading golden light, Naomi's figure grew ever smaller as she walked away with her dog steadfast, quiet, dignified. She did not look back. She did not need to, for her actions had spoken louder than any words could. And behind her, on the grass by the pond, Richard clutched his son tightly, lost in thought, burdened by the weight of his prejudice, and humbled by the courage of the woman he had once called untrustworthy. The camera of the moment lingered there on a man finally beginning to see, on a boy safe in his mother's arms, and on the quiet truth that had unfolded in the golden light of an ordinary afternoon. Then, slowly, the scene faded.